Test, test. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Mark Hamrick. I'm a former president of the National Press Club. I'm currently president of the Society of American Business Editors and Writers and Washington bureau chief with Bankrate.com. The National Press Club is the world's leading professional organization for journalists committed to our profession's future through our programming with events such as this while working to foster a free press around the world. For more information about the club, please visit the website at press.org, and to donate to programs offered to the public through the National Press Club Journalism Institute, please visit press.org/institute. So on behalf of our members worldwide, I'd like to welcome our speaker and those of you in the audience today. Our head table includes guests of our speaker as well as working journalists who are club members. Constantly, we remind people that if you hear applause in the audience, we'd like to note that members of the general public attend, so it's not necessarily evidence of a lack of journalistic objectivity. We'd also like to welcome our C-SPAN and other audiences here today, and you can follow the action live on Twitter using the hashtag NPCLive. After our guest speech concludes, we'll have a question and answer period, and I will ask as many of those questions as time will permit. Now it's time to introduce our head table guests. I'd ask each of you to stand briefly as your name is announced and hold off on the applause until afterward. We'll begin on this end of the table, welcoming Paula Hong, who is an intern at Wiener Public News and a student at Georgetown University, bravely studying journalism and government. Good to have you here today. And we want to note that she is working with the Headliners team member who organized today's luncheon. That's Robert Wiener, president of Wiener Public News, and as I said, a member of the Headliners team. Thank you for all your work, Bob. On down to the head table again, Jillian Rich is a reporter at Investors Business Daily. Sheila Redzeppi is vice president for external and corporate relations with the World Bank Group. Nancy Chen, anchor at our local ABC affiliate, WJLA-TV. Kristalina Gorgieva is Chief Executive Officer at the World Bank. Good to have you here today. Skipping over the podium, to my right is Betsy Fisher-Martin, Executive in Residence at American University and co-chair of the NPC Headliners team. Skipping over our guest speaker, Donna Borak is Senior Economics Writer at CNN Money. Kevin Wensing is a captain with the U.S. Navy, retired, Executive Director of First Global Challenge. Thank you for your service, Kevin. Bob, I didn't realize you were back at the head table, so we got you earlier, so I apologize for that. A little sleight of hand and musical chairs. So we got Kevin, then Frank Islam is Chairman and CEO of FI Investment Group. And now a round of applause for our head table. Thank you. Now to our guest speaker today. The World Bank was created at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, along with the International Monetary Fund, with which it's often confused. The World Bank might be described as the biggest community bank on the planet. The main mission of the bank involves projects targeting the community and local levels. Projects like alleviating poverty and helping women to climb the economic ladder, and those focusing on improving the health of people living in the developing world. This is the work of the World Bank under the leadership of Dr. Yong Kim, its 12th president. Our guest speaker holds a PhD in anthropology and is also a physician. He was born in Seoul, South Korea, but spent most of his childhood growing up in Iowa. A team leader going back to his youth, he was quarterback of his high school football team. Hailing from a family of high achievers, his father taught dentistry and his mother got a PhD in philosophy. He is joining us today to discuss the bank's outlook for the world economy and some of the key projects and goals that it has for 2018 and beyond. Dr. Kim began his first term as World Bank president in 2012, was reappointed in September 2016 to a second 5-year term. The World Bank is comprised of 5 institutions providing both funding and technical assistance to countries and private organizations with the goal of reducing poverty and boosting prosperity around the world. In other words, it is an ambitious effort. Unlike his predecessors, Dr. Kim did not come from the political or financial arenas. Rather, his background is in public health, medicine, and academic leadership. He was one of several founders of Partners Health, an organization providing community-based health care in poor countries. He went on to lead the World Health Organization's HIV/AIDS program, and immediately prior to being nominated and elected World Bank president, he served 4 years as president of Dartmouth College. By his own admission a couple of decades ago, Dr. Kim was part of a movement that he described that sought to close the World Bank, but he said that he's glad that movement failed. Under his current leadership, the World Bank is calling for the end of extreme poverty by 2030 and to boost shared prosperity, focusing on the bottom 40% of the population in developing countries. But how to meet those goals? At a recent press conference, Dr. Kim gave a hint when he referenced some positive trends, but also had some words of caution. He said after several years of disappointing growth, the global economy has begun to accelerate, trade is picking up, but investment remains weak. He noted his concern about risks, including the rise in protectionism, policy uncertainty, or a possible financial market turbulence, which could derail the global economic recovery. So as you can tell, we have plenty to discuss and think about today. Please give a warm National Press Club welcome to Dr. Yong Kim.
Thank you so much, Mark, for the introduction, and I'll start with some comments, but then I look forward to the discussion. I'm so glad to be here at the National Press Club. And all of us know that in the midst of frantic news cycles and competition for our attention, I just want to step back a bit and reflect on what we've been doing at the World Bank Group to try to build what I've been calling the new foundations of human solidarity. Now, this is at a time when these very foundations of human solidarity are under question and sometimes even under attack. Peace and stability are critical to our efforts to grow economies and help people lift themselves out of poverty. We recently launched a report that surveyed 750 multinational investors and corporate executives. And we asked them, what is most important to you when you think about investing in a developing country? The top 3 issues were political stability, security, and the right regulatory environment, of course, the policy environment, all of which are key areas of focus for our work. Now, I'll start with the good news about the global economy. Growth is robust worldwide. We predict 2.7% this year. And the second quarter of last year saw the highest quarterly growth rates since 2010. Trade's picking up. Around the world, millions of people each year continue to lift themselves out of poverty. But this is also a time when multiple crises are either in full bloom or looming on the horizon. Conflict, pandemics, climate change, and famine are impacting people all over the world and contributing to an historic number of people who have been forced to migrate. Countries in nearly every region are turning inward. International and homegrown terrorism now affects every corner of the world. It often feels like increasingly the interconnected global community is pulling apart, pulling away from each other. The World Bank Group was founded exactly to tackle these kinds of challenges. And if you read back at some of the historical documents from the Bretton Woods Conference, it's striking how much the language of that time could apply to today. We have a specific mission and goals, which I'll talk about in a bit. As an institution, we're part of the post-1945 world order that was predicated on the notion that what affects one city, one country, one region can have immediate and lasting impacts on all of us. That's a notion that has driven our work, and it drives, in fact, the entire multilateral system. The global order that's helped ensure decades of relative peace and prosperity was, in many ways, an American vision. Long before it was clear that the Allies would win World War II, President Franklin Roosevelt began looking ahead to the world beyond the war. He knew that it wouldn't be enough to shape the post-war order. He wouldn't that the existing institutions wouldn't be enough to shape the post-war order. The United States had to lead an effort to build an entirely new system that wouldn't just prevent world wars, but would ensure a lasting peace. Roosevelt knew that stable global financial systems were critical. So he tasked his Treasury Secretary at the time, Henry Morgenthau, to design it. The Treasury Department's plan for a fund to oversee global financial stability and a bank to support reconstruction and development was the foundation for what became the IMF and the World Bank Group. In the summer of 1944, in the Mount Washington Resort in Bretton Woods, a group of people met. And at that time, the Allied forces were fighting in Normandy. And so the remarkable thing about the Bretton Woods Conference is it happened while the war was still going on. China had sent a representative. Of course, the UK, under the leadership of John Maynard Keynes and Henry Morgenthau, were the leaders. But the 44 nations that attended spoke about the most critical issues. When Secretary Morgenthau opened the conference, he said that the goal was to create, and I quote him, a dynamic world economy in which the people of every nation will be able to realize their potentialities in peace, to raise their own standards of living and enjoy, increasingly, the fruits of material progress. For freedom of opportunity is the foundation for all other freedoms. For the past 70 years, that world order, the United Nations, NATO, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank Group, OECD, has helped ensure relative peace and stability. And from the very beginning, the mission of the World Bank Group has been to help ensure that everyone has opportunity, what Morgenthau called freedom of opportunity. The World Bank's first mission was to fund reconstruction in Europe. In fact, the first loan that the World Bank ever made was to France. But after the Marshall Plan, after the announcement of the Marshall Plan at a commencement address at Harvard in 1946 by General Marshall, the focus of the World Bank shifted to development and poverty reduction. The institution grew and evolved into the World Bank Group that exists today. As Mark said, 5 institutions that provide our client countries with specialized financial tools and global knowledge, and that's key. We're the only global multilateral development institution, and the value proposition is that we bring knowledge from every corner of the earth to every one of our clients. The very first institution formed in Bretton Woods is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or IBRD. IBRD uses its AAA rating to issue bonds, and the financial people here, we have one of the best AAAs in the world. We borrow at LIBOR minus 15 basis points, which is not quite as good as the US Treasury, but close. We issue bonds, we borrow money in the capital markets, and then provide loans to middle-income countries. It's critical for us to invest in middle-income countries because they represent about 1/3 of global GDP. And in addition to being major engines of global economic growth, more than 2/3 of people living in poverty live in middle-income countries. Another arm of the bank is the International Development Association, or IDA, as we call it. And it was founded at the request of President Eisenhower. Again, deep connections to the history of the United States. Requested by President Eisenhower in 1960 to provide concessional, in other words, close to zero interest loans with a maturity of about 40 years, a payback period of about 40 years, and grants to the world's poorest countries. And now we have about 75 countries that qualify for these low interest loans. We also have a private sector arm that was founded 60 years ago. The International Finance Corporation, or IFC, invests in the private sector in developing countries. IFC makes equity investments in companies, uses tools such as first loss guarantees to de-risk sectors, and creates markets to bring in other private sector investment. The first loan ever provided by IFC was to the German company Siemens, who wanted to invest in Brazil at a time when Brazil was truly a frontier market. We have another agency, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, or MIGA. It helps de-risk projects, sectors, and entire countries by providing political risk insurance and credit enhancement. Just to tell you, MIGA actually invented political risk insurance. And what that is if a company wants to invest in a country, wants to purchase a company, for example, and they're worried about bad things happening, like, for example, a change of regime and the regime nationalizes that company, you can buy insurance to protect you against that possibility. We invented it. Now there are many, many companies that do it, and it's sometimes the critical link to making a company invest or not invest. And finally, we have our International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, which facilitates arbitration between international investors. Over the past 2 decades, ICSID, as we call it, has helped settle many disputes around the world, including several related to NAFTA. Every day when World Bank Group staff walk into our building, they pass a large sign that reads, "Our dream is a world free of poverty." And that was put up there by my friend and predecessor, Jim Wolfenson. In different ways, each arm of the World Bank Group contributes to that dream of lifting people out of poverty. You know, one of the great untold stories is we've made tremendous progress in the past 3 decades in reducing poverty. The percentage of people in the world living in extreme poverty, which by our definition is living on less than $1.90 a day, has gone from 35% 30 years ago to less than 10% today. Nearly 1.1 billion people have lifted themselves out of poverty since 1990. The majority of those, of course, were in China, that was responsible for lifting 700 million people out of extreme poverty. But there's still a tremendous amount of work to do. Some 770 million people still live in extreme poverty today. So to make the dream of a world free of poverty a reality, we're using powerful financial tools. I like to say that we're using the tools of the rich. The rich people use these tools every day to make themselves wealthier. We're trying to use these tools now on behalf of the poor. We've always innovated. The swap, where parties exchange cash flows to achieve positions that are more in line with their risk profile, we invented the swap. We use now swaps to mitigate currency risk and interest rate risk. And we're developing new derivative instruments to manage all kinds of risks, such as commodity risk, disaster risk, and even weather risk. And we've been developing these new tools all the time. I'll tell you about a few in just a bit. And so as we use these tools of the rich, such as leverage, swaps, derivatives, in insurance, we are trying to create new ones every day that specifically are focused on serving the poor. After I became president of the World Bank Group, I asked a pretty simple question. You know, we say that our dream is a world free of poverty, but why don't we put a deadline on that dream? And so we adopted 2 goals in the spring of 2013, about 9 months into my first term. And that is to end extreme poverty by 2030 and to boost shared prosperity. In other words, to boost the incomes of the bottom 40% of developing countries faster than the growth of the economy. And this was our first effort to directly address the question of inequality. A year ago, I outlined the 3 ways that we're working to get there. The first is to accelerate inclusive, sustainable economic growth. The second is to build resilience to shocks and threats like climate change, pandemics, refugees. And finally, by investing more and more effectively in people. The first pillar of the strategy is to accelerate inclusive, sustainable economic growth. And last spring, we, along with our colleagues, we called for a completely different approach so that we could maximize the amount of finance that countries could receive for their development purposes by systematically crowding in private sector investment. Everywhere we operate, we're asking a pretty simple question. How can we maximize resources? And what can we do to minimize at the same time public debt? So we answer the question by trying to find win-win solutions where investors get a good return and countries utilize these resources to meet their development goals. There's never been a better time to try to crowd in private sector investment. Right now, there's over $10 trillion sitting in negative interest rate bonds. And for the non-financial people here, this means that instead of giving your money to a bank and having them pay you interest, you give your money to a bank and you pay them to hold your money. That's what a negative interest rate bond is. The Japanese central bank, the European central bank, the German central bank, many others have negative interest rate bonds, and $10 trillion are sitting in those bonds. Another $24 trillion in very low yielding government securities, and $5 trillion in cash. Usually 1,000-euro bills sitting in people's safes. Now, all of these holders of capital are waiting for higher returns, and we think that we can create situations where they can both get higher returns and we can achieve development goals. We feel that the only chance we have to meet the exploding aspirations of people all over the world is to use these market-based approaches to development. When it came time to replenish our Ida Fund, and the Fund for the Poorest, a 40-year loan at 0%, as you can imagine, is not a sustainable business proposition unless countries donate every 3 years. And so what we did at our last replenishment was that we got a rating for Ida, and now we can borrow from capital markets with the equity that sits in Ida. And we were able, in doing that, to increase resources for Africa and the poorest countries by 50%. Now, the second pillar of our strategy is to build resilience to overlapping shocks and crises. We're helping countries build resilience by finding new ways to share risk with the capital market. Now, this is, I'm a medical doctor and an anthropologist, and I had not been trained in finance. But the last 5 years has been an intensive period of that kind of training. And I was just amazed at the tricks that wealthy companies and wealthy people use every day that are completely legal and turn out very well for them. And so we are committed to using those tools. And so when it comes to crises like pandemics, rather than sharing our risk with capital markets, the poor people often have to wait. And we saw that, of course, with Ebola. And you see it again and again. A cycle of panic during the height of the epidemic, and you all remember how panicked we were in the middle of the Ebola outbreaks, and then neglect, panic, neglect, panic, neglect. And so we wanted to avoid that process and avoid what happens as people quickly forget about these pandemics after the threat subsides. So this year we took a large step in breaking that cycle, and we created something called the Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility. For the first time, we have actual pandemic insurance, a $450 million policy that will disperse funds to the poorest countries automatically when an epidemic reaches a crucial stage. We were the first to provide any financial support during the Ebola outbreak, and that's not what we do. It's just that I happen to be an infectious disease doctor. I called my friends and heard that this was the worst thing that they'd ever seen. So we made the first commitment of $400 million, but it was probably 10 months too late. So now this new instrument will provide $50 million, as much as $50 million right away out of a cash window. But then if the epidemic continues, once it reaches a certain size, once it crosses borders, once there's a certain number of cases, it will automatically disperse as much as $450 million. Now, what we found was that, on a 3-year bond, pandemic bond, $450 million, we thought, gosh, and is anyone going to buy this? And, because they could lose all it's called a capital at risk, meaning all the $450 million could absolutely be gone and they would have none of their investment left. But it turns out that in today's market, if you offer the right interest rate, they will buy it. And so we sold this on the capital markets at around 8.7% total. And now, for the first time ever, we have insurance. We can move faster to prevent pandemics. And now, for the first time, this risk in low-income countries is shared with the financial markets. And so we're asking, can we do this for other problems? Why not famine? Why not other humanitarian crises? Can we create a famine bond? Can we create famine insurance? Can we create humanitarian catastrophe insurance? We're working on that now. Now, the third pillar of our strategy is to invest more and more effectively in people. Last month, we announced a new accelerated effort called the Human Capital Project. We're partnering with some of the world's best health economists, and we're using supercomputing power and new methods to analyze the quantity and quantify the stock of human capital in the world and its impact on economic growth. Now, we always knew that investing in people is the right thing to do. Now we're learning that economically, it may very well be the smartest thing to do. Over the past year, we've done several different analyses, and we're finding that investments in human beings, especially in health and education, and also social protection, are more powerfully correlated with economic growth than we ever thought. Too often, we still hear from leaders in the developing world, first we'll grow our economies, then we'll invest in our people. Well, it turns out that investing in people is investing in economic growth. The Human Capital Project will eventually include a ranking, which will be very controversial. But I believe that we have a moral responsibility to reveal to our shareholders the powerful relationship between investing in people and economic growth. And more importantly, we're ready to help every single country rapidly accelerate the quality and quantity of their human capital investments. Now, some of you may wonder why I use the term human capital. I do so because I'm communicating directly with ministers of finance. I want them to know that this is not about charity. It's about securing their country's economic future. Now, all of these efforts, the three major efforts, inclusive economic growth, resilience to the shocks, and investing in people, are focused on ensuring equality of opportunity. You know, in Davos this year in January, President Xi Jinping made a really very important speech in which he essentially said the global market system is the ocean we all swim in. Any effort to turn it back into streams or lakes will fail. And he set forth this notion that the project of creating equality of outcomes had failed. And now what we're trying to do is to create equality of opportunity. And what will that mean? How far would we have to go? Now, what we know is that aspirations are going up everywhere. As people see the way everyone else lives on their smartphones, the aspirations are going up. Aspirations linked to opportunity can breed dynamism and inclusive sustainable economic growth. But if there's no opportunity to achieve when you've already seen how everyone else is living, it can lead countries down the path of fragility, conflict, violence, extremism, and of course, eventually, migration. As we work to end poverty around the world, we play an important role in maintaining stability and opening markets. This is the path, we believe, to assuring economic growth. Global stability and open markets are critical for the United States. I grew up in Muscatine, Iowa. And by the way, you know, whenever people say I was quarterback of the football team, they think that's cool, but we lost every single game under my great leadership. Now, you know, only 10% of my graduating class went to college, and of the 10%, 90% of them went to community college. The rest went to work in factories, on the family farms, and as I talk now to friends back home, they're going through some very difficult times. But we want to stress, as the World Bank Group, the answer is not to turn inward. According to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, international trade supports more than 41 million American jobs. Our work helps support those jobs and create new ones. More than 50% of all U.S. exports are to countries where the World Bank has lending programs and where we're helping open markets. Crowding in the private sector in developing countries is the ultimate win-win. A growing and robust private sector is a critical driver of economic growth and one of the keys to reducing poverty for those countries. But we're also cultivating an economic and business climate that allows U.S. companies to sell and compete in the developing world. One example is Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, where cocoa exports are an economic mainstay. For years, Ivorian farmers used dilapidated trucks because they didn't have credit to buy new vehicles. So IFC, our private sector arm, teamed with Cargill, the Minnesota-based company, to start the Cargill Co-op Academy, which trains farmers on business skills, financial management, and the best agricultural practices. IFC supported a program that made affordable credit available to farmer co-ops for new trucks and tractors. Today, more than 120,000 farmers in Côte d'Ivoire have received training. More than 66,000 farmers and 50 co-ops participated in the credit programs. And Cargill now has a more dependable supply of cocoa. Cargill and IFC are working on another joint venture to train more than 50,000 farmers in Cameroon. Keeping markets open and creating new ones requires stability. So we're focusing even more of our work in areas of fragility, conflict, and violence. This is critical to our goal of ending poverty. If current trends continue and instability continues, we estimate that by 2030, almost 50% of the extreme poor will be living in fragile and conflict-affected states. So we're innovating, and we created a private sector window in our IDA, our Fund for the Poorest Countries, which will bring more investment to countries affected by fragility and conflict. We're working with partners like the United Nations to prevent conflict in countries at risk of instability. In addition to the lives saved, if we could prevent conflict in countries that bear the direct costs, casualties and the direct costs, like casualties and losses to economic growth, we would avoid over $34 billion of losses every year just by preventing conflict and violence. This isn't new work for the bank. In 1995, as war raged in former Yugoslavia, World Bank experts began preparing for post-war reconstruction. Just days after the ceasefire, when the Serbian section of Sarajevo was still in flames, a World Bank team landed on the ground and began assessments. They quickly finalized an emergency recovery project of $160 million. And when the Dayton Peace Accords were signed, the bank had lined up $500 million from donor countries to accelerate reconstruction. America's military leaders understand the necessity of development partners. Earlier this year, more than 120 retired generals and admirals affirmed in a letter to congressional leaders that, and I quote from the letter, "The military will lead the fight against terrorism on the battlefield, but it needs strong civilian partners in the battle against drivers of extremism, lack of opportunity, insecurity, injustice, and hopelessness." The World Bank Group is often that partner. In places like Iraq, for example, we're supporting the government in finding new ways to bring private investment into a country under the most difficult circumstances. Years of war and neglect have damaged Iraq's energy grid, leading to daily blackouts that cripple the economy. We helped the government bring in $375 million of private financing. This is while the conflict with ISIS was ongoing for the northern region. That funding also supported the completion of the first phase of a new power plant that will supply about half of Baghdad's energy. We do all of this, we think, with exceptional value. Over the last 7 decades, the international community has contributed $19 billion to capitalize and fund IBRD, our middle income fund, and IFC, our private sector group. Since 1945, the United States has contributed $2.5 billion. Now, we've been able to take that $19 billion in overall investment to fund more than $900 million. We're getting close to $1 trillion now in loans and financing in developing countries. We've also put $50 billion in reserves and transferred $28 billion to IDA, our Fund for the Poorest. So we actually support our own Fund for the Poorest. For every dollar that countries invest in the World Bank Group, we're able to have an impact that's tens and even hundreds of times more powerful than if they put their money directly in the form of grants into budgets of developing countries. Now, for most of my adult life, I've worked to provide health care to people in some of the poorest countries in the world. The organization that I co-founded that Mark mentioned, Partners in Health, has worked for 3 decades around a principle that we called making a preferential option for the poor. Borrowing from Latin American Catholic theology, a preferential option for the poor requires us to work to ensure that everyone in our communities of focus had access to health care, nutrition, education, and a safe place to sleep. When I became president of the World Bank Group, I brought some of that philosophy with me, a moral obligation to provide everyone in our client countries with opportunities to achieve their highest aspirations. Helping poor countries develop is not an exercise in charity. It's an investment in a stable, secure, more prosperous world, improving stability in countries emerging from conflict, and investing in poor countries racked by hopelessness and frustration are good for the entire world, including the United States. As I said before, investors above all are looking for stability, and we're working towards that goal every day. Let me make one other less obvious point. Strong American participation in multilateral institutions and multilateral development is an opportunity to promote principles that we value as a nation: respect for self-reliance, equality of opportunity, openness and fairness, and our regard for the beliefs, dignity, and aspirations of others. Those principles are embedded in the foundation of our institution. To go back to Henry Morgenthau, he told the delegates assembled in New Hampshire that the new financial order would be based on an elementary economic axiom. he said that prosperity has no fixed limits. It's not a finite substance to be diminished by division. On the contrary, the more of it that other nations enjoy, the more each nation will have for itself. For 7 decades, we've helped billions lift themselves out of poverty, and we've contributed to maintaining peace and stability around the world. If we have the right resources and fully commit to this effort, we can do the same for decades to come and help build the kind of world that we will be proud to leave to our children. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we have a very engaged audience. We've had no shortage of questions. So, you know, having been in this position a number of times where we got no questions, we're very happy to have the audience participate. Obviously, the World Bank's largest shareholder is the U.S., and this seemed to have been the point that you ended your speech on, about the engagement of the United States government on the global stage. The U.S. has long supported the mission and goals of the organization. So do you worry that under the current administration that support for the World Bank and related institutions will be cut back?
Okay. Well, you know, for 70 years under many different administrations, we've always valued and worked very hard in maintaining the relationship with the United States. And I have to tell you, we're working very closely with the U.S. government. We just, with Ivanka Trump, started the Women's Entrepreneurship Financing Initiative. And really, with her advocacy, we were able to raise a huge amount of $350 million in about 4 months, which will be translated into a, we hope, multi-billion-dollar fund for women entrepreneurs in developing countries. And Ivanka has promised me that she'll be involved herself in mentoring these young women entrepreneurs. This is an absolute innovation. We've never had this kind of financing for women entrepreneurs before, and we've been in active discussions with other parts of the administration as well. Also, you know, the Treasury, the U.S. Treasury is the governor of the World Bank Group, and we also have been working very closely with them. You know, the people in Treasury have raised a number of very legitimate questions that we have to resolve as we're now going through a process of trying to improve our capital position. But you know, we feel that those questions are perfectly legitimate and that we have good answers for those questions. And so I remain optimistic. I mean, it's actually kind of rare that people from the White House would come to us with innovative ideas about what we could do. And now that people in the White House know our business model so well, we're hoping that there'll be more joint work.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Ivanka Trump, because that obviously has been a headline-generating relationship. Could you talk about what her current involvement is in this project?
So, you know, this is a standard World Bank project. So the World Bank, the financing will be provided to countries and individual women entrepreneurs based on the rules of the World Bank Group. So Ivanka herself won't have any role in deciding where the money goes. And so her role has been to be an advocate for the idea, and then her role will be to mentor the people who are given these grants. And so there's you know, the process of deciding where it goes is going to go through the standard World Bank process, which includes all the different countries that have contributed to the fund, which is 15. There have been 15 countries that have contributed to the fund.
So you said what she won't do. What will she do?
So first of all, it was critically important for her to have championed this fund to begin with. But so we're creating a network. Now, what often happens is that we provide women with, you know, with a microenterprise, the tiny loans, and the women do very well. But very few of them are able to go from those tiny loans to actually creating a formal business. And so this is that fund that's going to help them create that business. And so when they create that business, we will give them access to an online virtual network. So if they have a question, look, I'm trying to put my HR system together and here are the problems, they would either type it in or you know, get on the phone. And then there will be a network of entrepreneurs. I think most of them will be women entrepreneurs who will then provide them direct feedback on how they can solve their problem. She has told us she's going to be part of that network.
Okay. Maybe we'll come back to the issue of women's participation in the global economy in a moment, but let's stick on this theme of globalization and the would-be reversal of it. Given the waves of nationalism that have been seen around the world, how is that affecting your mission today, and how concerned are you about it endangering the mission in the future?
Well, so we're seeing lots of different political developments in different areas, and we are by our Articles of Agreement, we are forbidden from getting involved in the internal politics of any of our member countries. So we are officially a non-political organization, but of course we have to watch carefully because things that happen on a political level have a huge impact on the economy. So, when we say policy uncertainty here, we're not sure what will happen with the different trade agreements in the United States. We're not sure what's going to happen with Brexit. And so our role is to simply follow these developments as closely as we can and then prepare countries for the various things that might happen under these different political decisions. So our role is not to make any judgment on what happens politically, but to prepare for the fallout when they do happen.
Well, sure, because we understood from your speech that you're embarking on all these innovative financial strategies to try to essentially take a bet against the worst case scenario, such as a pandemic. So, that is placing a financial bet. So if you're placing financial bets for the future on the political outlook, are you betting on further backing away from globalization?
Well,
figuratively speaking, in the sense of the bet.
So, I'm an anthropologist, and whenever someone uses a bunch of words like globalization, my first question is, well, what do you mean by that? Right? And so, I don't see trade decreasing right now. I see trade increasing. And when you have someone like President Xi, who makes the kind of statement that he did. I mean, he was essentially saying, unless we have open borders, more trade, more movement of ideas, capital, people, the world is in trouble. And we are inexorably moving in that direction. And so the key is to make sure, if you use his analogy, if it's the ocean we all swim in, then you have to make sure that everyone can swim. Now, that's what we're doing. There's always and constantly a drumbeat of saying, let's not do so much for other people, let's do things for ourselves. And at different times, that has gone up and down. It was right before the United States, joined Britain in World War II. That was exactly the conversation that they were having here in the United States. And so I think that kind of language goes up and down, but I think it's just very hard to imagine a world in which every country in the world will close up. The countries that close their borders to trade will simply suffer because there's no talk of that in the African countries I've seen, Latin America, South Asia. I mean, the East Asia certainly. If one or two countries decides to really stop trading, that will be a disaster for that country.
Let's talk about the role of women. How does the World Bank promote development for women when women entrepreneurs are a minority of women in developing countries? What kind of role will the Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative created this summer play in that?
So, when I first came to the bank, and before I came to the bank, I heard a lot about gender disaggregated data, right? Gender-informed projects. And I thought, what does that mean? I mean, is that real? And it turns out that the first thing you have to do is just know what impact your projects are having on women. And we didn't really collect that information. We thought, well, these projects are working or they're not working. But when we took the next step to say, well, is it working for women? It really informed the work we were doing in a way that was far more powerful than I had thought it would be. And so now every single project, before it goes to the board, we have to know what the impact on women will be, whether women are included. We have also focused in some instances, like, for example, we've invested in some banks in developing countries, and we've encouraged them to set up specific branches for women. Because often what happens is that women will go into their traditional banks and just be ignored. So the data is just absolutely overwhelming that greater participation of women will lead to significant economic growth. I mean, these numbers are easily quantifiable. And so the message is very clear that setting, in creating situations where women can work, where women have, for example, childcare so that they can work, these are critical for economic growth. These are not issues of justice alone. They're very much issues of justice, but they're also issues of economic growth that's left on the table because you have not taken the time to make access to finance, to markets, for women a priority.
We tend to be U.S.-centric here in the United States. What are some of the most challenging developing countries in the world for women, and where would you hope or expect to see progress, let's say, over the coming decade?
Well, you know, there are great differences. Let me just give you a couple of examples. So there are places in the world where very strict laws restrict the movement of women, but there are also places in the world that are very advanced economies where still women can't participate in the economy. So Korea, I mean, it's interesting. When I go to Korea, for some reason, because I was born there, I speak the language, I tend to be a little disinhibited, and I say exactly what I think to the Koreans. And what I've said to them is that, you know, sexism is one of the greatest challenges. Korea has the lowest female participation in the workforce of any OECD country, and you know they are literally leaving many, many you know, GDP growth points on the table by not making it possible. Now, Japan also has this issue, but Prime Minister Abe has made it a top priority. He's creating things like a professionalized childcare workforce. He's pushing so that women are on the boards of the major companies, and he's made it part of his policy to bring women into the workforce. I think that that's a very wise thing to do. It'll be culturally difficult, but now Korea has to focus on doing that, and of course other East Asian economies as well. We really believe that the countries that are going to do the best are the countries that understand the importance of women, not in every aspect of life.
Then there's the role of leadership in organizations such as yours, and one of those leaders sitting to my left here. The questioner says, because there's been so much change in the world, and possibly that's been reflected in changes at the World Bank, do you think the next president of the World Bank should be a non-American woman, perhaps from Asia or elsewhere in the world? And after all, these are the regions that still need the most from the World Bank. Doesn't having an American traditionally as the head of the organization hurt its standing around the world? Yeah.
So a couple of quick points. So first of all, when I leave the World Bank, the good news is that I will have no influence on who the next president of the World Bank will be. You know, for good or bad, the global system sort of has a set of what's the right word, of informal agreements. So the head of UNICEF is always an American. The head of the World Health Organization is never an American. The head of the UN, Secretary General of the UN, is never from the Permanent Five of the Security Council. Americans have a few slots. One is the World Food Program, the other is UNICEF, and the other is the World Bank Group. So I think it's, you know, the board of the World Bank should choose whoever is the best candidate. And you know, there are candidates in this room who would be great as the next president of the World Bank Group. But I think that's the issue that has to be resolved. There has been this informal dividing up of positions in the world. And so we'll just have to decide how that's going to work. I mean, are we going to go away from that and then make every position open for everyone? Maybe, but as they say, that's above my pay grade in terms of deciding. Look, I think leadership can come from anywhere, and I'll tell you one story. A leader of a great nation in Asia, who I've become friends with, you know, he asked me about the election process last year, and I said to him, well, he said to me, well, what's the issue? I said, well, you know, I think people are sensitive about an American continuing to have this job. And he looked me in the eye, and in trying to give me the highest possible compliment, he said, but Jim, we've never thought of you as an American. Right? Now, you know, I played football in Muscatine, Iowa in high school, okay? I'm in so many ways as American as you can be, but I speak 3 languages. I've spent a lot of my time in Africa. And I think that no matter what your citizenship is, if you care about these issues, if you care enough to learn languages, if you care enough to spend time in Africa and South Asia, that whatever your nationality, your ability to embrace the entire world should be the top criterion for becoming president of the World Bank Group.
So again, a question about the relationship with the current administration. The Treasury Secretary recently called on the bank to reduce lending to middle-income countries that have developed significant resources of their own, saying that the World Bank program should be, quote, tailored to help fully transition those borrowers off donor assistance. What do you think of that, and are there plans to look into that suggestion?
Absolutely. We're looking into it right now, and it's a perfectly legitimate and important question for us to address. But here's how it works. So we're actually a bank. I mean, people have said, you guys are like a bank with a brain or like a university with a lending arm. We're kind of both those things. I have 3,000 PhDs who work at the World Bank Group, some of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. And so, it is a living, breathing kind of an academic institution, but it's also a bank. And so the first rule of any bank is you have to have a diversity of investments. And so if we were to get out of middle-income countries altogether, and some people have said you should only work in fragile and conflict-affected states. So if we did that, our AAA rating would no longer be a AAA rating. I mean, there is a genius to 70 years of putting this institution together, and it's a combination of less risky investments with very risky investments. We're now being asked to do even riskier investments, which we're happy to do, but in order for us to do that, we have to have some balance in our portfolio. But more importantly, middle-income countries is where 70+% of the extreme poor live, right? And just because of their size. And so if we were to neglect middle-income countries altogether, we would have to give up on this mission of ending extreme poverty. So we don't want to do that. And I think this is truly a cooperative. I can't stress enough. In 1945, they were looking backwards historically, and they said, wars in Europe, currency fluctuations that went up and down. Everyone, those of you who are in the financial world or in the monetary world, the beggar thy neighbor approaches where you tried everything you could to devalue, your own currency vis-a-vis others. These kinds of things were happening every day. There was no place where people could go to talk together if there was a conflict. Well, many would say that the post-1945 world order has led to a lot of great things. The European Union also is part of it. We haven't had wars in Europe. There has been a place to go. And in the case of the World Bank Group, it's truly a cooperative. Usually we try to work by consensus. So this is a place where, despite the fact that countries will be actively at war with each other, they can get together, sit at the table, and talk about how can we help Somalia? How can we help the refugees? What can we do after the hurricanes in the Caribbean? There's a place where whatever conflict is existing on a political realm, we can talk about things that we want to do for the poorest people in the world. That I can't stress to you how important it is to have that. And if we got rid of all the existing institutions, we'd have to invent them again.
So this is sort of a question about how things have evolved over the years, and someone asked, do you partner with organizations such as the Gates Foundation and a number of other sort of peer organizations like that, and how does that relationship work, and how has it changed your work?
Yeah, one of the things I've tried to do in the last 5 years is to just completely change the way we work with other organizations, and Sheila has really been at the center of that. So one of the things was that I came to this job, and the Secretary General of the United States, of the United Nations, was Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. As I say, my homeboy from Korea. And so, we met and we hit it off right away.
You call him that, by the way?
I call him sanbenim, which is like a very honorific term for, someone who's come before you. And it was very easy for us because, I just got into a very, culturally appropriate relationship with him, where I used a very honorific language with him. He did with me as well. But, we would be sitting, there was one day we were at an event, and President Clinton happened to be there, and we were speaking to each other in Korean. He said, "What are y'all talking about? You guys are going to take over the world." And so we would go to places, and we would be, we traveled a lot together. We traveled to some of the most difficult places in the world together, and so we would be there in a room full of military people, heads of state, and we'd just start speaking to each other in Korean. And it would be about, well, what are we going to eat tonight for dinner? But they always thought that something was going on with us. And what really was going on is that we have now brought together the United Nations and the World Bank in a way that it never has been before. So when he and I traveled for the first time to Africa, he landed on the ground. He said, you know, we looked at the history books, and the World Bank president and the Secretary General of the United Nations had never, ever traveled together before. Right? It's like, but 70 years ago when these institutions were created, that was kind of the idea, that these institutions would all work together. Now, the person in the UN who really was most important in bringing the relationship together was Antonio Guterres, who's now the current Secretary General. So we think that this relationship will continue, and it'll get even stronger. And you know, that's just the UN. With foundations, we've made lots of efforts to do more with foundations, and so we've worked on lots of specific issues. But the other thing we're doing is we're saying to the foundations and to the donor countries, you know, we have this sort of, what would you say, it's kind of like a global public good, and that's our AAA rating. And because we borrow at such low interest rates, what we're telling everybody is you can give, you know, $10 million directly, or you can take the $10 million and then combine it with a loan, and instead of giving, you know, $10 million of grant and you know, $40 million of relatively high interest loans, you can combine those two and give $50 million of 0% interest money that they can pay back in 20 years. And that's a fantastic way of stretching resources, which I think we're going to have to do more and more.
You talked about human capital investment. The questioner says, so what's your view of the potential impact of robotics, artificial intelligence, and automation? And obviously that has ramifications with respect to the workforce going forward.
See, I should have known. National Press Club, you're going to just ask me a lot of tough questions. So here's and I talked about it a little bit in the speech. Here's what worries me most: little children. Will everybody have access to high-speed internet? Well, I've heard that latest estimates are that all of Africa will have access to 4G LTE by 2020. So not everyone's going to be able to afford smartphones, but they're all going to know someone who has a smartphone. So they're looking at how everyone lives in the world. And what we know happens, and we've done research on this, is that if you have access to the internet, your aspirations go up. The income to which you compare your own, we call it the reference income, goes up. So you want a higher income, you have higher aspirations. I was born in one of the poorest countries in the world, 1959, in Korea. I think having higher aspirations is great. But in the context of the higher aspirations that come from looking at your smartphone, being on the internet, at the same time, technology is eliminating lots of tasks, which in turn will eliminate lots of jobs. So our prediction, you know, if you ask the question, how many jobs that currently exist will be eliminated by automation, let's say in India, our estimation is 66%. Ethiopia, 85%. So the jobs will disappear. Now, will there be new jobs created? Well, I think we have to look for completely different models for how countries will grow. The normal assumption is that you go from agriculture to light manufacturing, garments, shoes, and then to heavy industry. But right now, there's not a single African country that has reached the level of efficiency of Bangladesh in garments. And what I hear from the 3D printing companies is that 3D printing will make all the garments and all the shoes pretty soon. Other people say, well, maybe not so soon. I don't know what the answer is, but this is why we're so focused on human capital. Because the one thing we know will be valuable no matter what happens, no matter what direction the global economy goes, is healthy people with good minds who've been educated. So you know, the reason we're creating this ranking and that we're going to create all this controversy is because unless everyone gets on board with trying to improve their human capital, we're going to see a lot of extremely unhappy people with very high aspirations.
Thank you for that. We're going to bring this program into for a soft landing here, but before we conclude, I'd like to remind the audience about some upcoming events. On December 12th, we'll have a Headliners book event with Donna Brazil. I believe she's been in the news lately. She's the former DNC chair and longtime Democratic strategist who shares her new book, Hacks, the inside story of the break-ins and breakdowns that put Donald Trump in the White House. And on December 18th, we'll have a NBC Headliners breakfast with Walter Isaacson, and he'll talk about his new book about Leonardo da Vinci. Now, before we ask the last question, as you may know, we do have a traditional ceremony here at the National Press Club in which we truly do present a token of our appreciation, and that's the iconic National Press Club coffee mug. So there you go. Thank you. Thank you for that. And our last question, this is not necessarily one of the harder questions that we could have asked today, but obviously you're president of the World Bank. Who balances the checkbook in your family?
Not me. I can tell you for sure, not me. My wife does, and yeah. Let me just leave it at that.
Very good, short and sweet. How about a round of applause for our guest speaker?
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank our National Press Club staff, including the Journalism Institute and the Broadcast Center, for organizing today's event. And you can find more information about the National Press Club on our website. You can also get a copy of today's program. Please visit press.org. And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you. There you go.
Very good.
You're very kind. It's a pleasure to meet you. Good luck with all your travels. Do you get to take a break for the holidays?